Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. According to 1 Peter 3:15, we continue today. Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas, the best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages, the host of the nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series Socrates in the City, the prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. Today we continue with chapter 26 of Is Atheism Dead, where we talk about the role that Christianity played in the birth of science. The title of the chapter is Christianity Begat Science. It's using the begat word as a play on words because the word begat is used in the book of in the Bible, mainly in the book of Genesis, in the beginning with people being born. It's one thing to say that faith and science are compatible, but it's of another order entirely to say that Christian faith itself led to the rise of modern science. This may be the very last thing devoted secularists wish to hear, but from an historical perspective, it's quite undeniable that the Christian faith led to the rise of modern science. So it is therefore past time that this be clearly understood and made known. In the book The Soul of Science, Christian Faith and Natural Philosophy, written by Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton, Pearcey and Thaxton make the case that Christianity led to the rise of modern science. They make the case particularly compellingly, explaining that it was the worldview of the Christian faith that uniquely enabled science to emerge and to flourish. In other words, science did not come inevitably into human culture, and without Christian theology, it could not have emerged as it did. Science was not going to become the force that it is if it were not for the Christian faith that undergirded it in its infancy. The science writer Lauren Isley says that several great civilizations have arisen and vanished without the benefit of scientific philosophy. True. I wonder what other, in this present generation of the 21st century, other than the Western world, the industrialized Western world, I wonder, are there any civilizations that experience benefit from scientific philosophy? I would guess that there are few. I don't think science is the religion. I would be surprised if science is the religion, for lack of a better term, that it is in America. Scientism is a religion. It sure has the traits of a religion. That these great many civilizations did not produce what we think of as a scientific method or a scientific revolution is a curious historical fact. That statement almost relates to the statement that I just made. So when and how did science arise? Why did it happen? And why did it happen? Why did science arise when it arose and where it arose? To be clear, science as we know it arose only in Western Christendom in the late Middle Ages and flourished in the early 16th and 17th century in what we now call the scientific revolution. Isley says science is an invented cultural institution, an intuition not present in all societies, and not one that may be counted upon to arise from human instinct. He explains that science demands some kind of unique soil in which to flourish. As Piercy and Thaxton point out, Isley rather reluctantly admits that Christianity itself is at the heart of what gave rise to science. In one of those strange permutations, Isley writes, of which history yields occasional rare examples, it is the Christian world which finally gave birth in a clear, articulate fashion to the experimental method of science itself. Ooh. People like Dawkins are going to cringe at that. Unlike Hitchens and Dawkins, Isley prizes truth enough to admit what he sees, whether he likes it or doesn't. But Piercy and Thaxton make it quite clear that Isley is far from alone in seeing this. Innumerable scholars from the widest variety of philosophical viewpoints have acknowledged the same and have admitted that Christianity provided both intellectual presuppositions and moral sanction for the development of modern science. But in perpetuating the ahistorical myth that science and religion are enemies, the four horsemen of the new atheism pretend to know none of this and gallop along silently. Yeah, you don't hear the new atheists who argue so vehemently against religion of any kind. You don't hear them talk about the history of science and how Christianity undergirded it. Piercy and Thaxton say a number of cultures in antiquity, ranging from the Chinese to the Arabs to the Greeks, produced a level of learning and technology actually higher than that of medieval Europe. Yet none of these cultures ever gave us anything approaching to science during the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Only Western Christendom gave birth to science as a systematic, self-correcting discipline, and subsequently brought us the spectacular scientific advances that we have enjoyed ever since. But why? What did Western Christendom have that was missing from these other extraordinary and otherwise advanced cultures? Was it simply a happy coincidence that things developed this way? Might Western Christendom have led to science not because of, but in spite of its beliefs? Seems not. Philosophers of science and historians of many stripes all agree that it was the Christian theology prevalent across Europe during this time that opened the door to the scientific revolution and to the extraordinary discoveries that have followed. For example, the esteemed historian Alfred North Whitehead says the rise of science in Christian civilization was owing to certain habits of thought, such as the lawfulness of nature. According to Whitehead, these habits and ideas came directly from the Christian doctrine of the world as a divine creation. In other words, Christians believed that the matter in the universe had order and obeyed certain rules because of the God who created them. So it followed that they could understand those rules and that order, which led to science as we know it. Right. So when you, I think back to when I was going through I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. The point was repeatedly made in there that we live in a theistic universe. And because we live in a theistic universe, there are certain laws that are always at work in that universe. And that because those laws are constantly functioning, certain things are discoverable. And if it were not for these predictable laws, things would not be discoverable. And there has to be something dependable keeping those laws consistently in force. And that something dependable would be the theistic God. Would be someone dependable, and that would be the theistic God. So the matter obeys certain rules because God created the rules and made it such that people who do science can discover those rules, and that has led to science as we know it. In his book, The Grand Titration, the biochemist Joseph Needham makes this point, explaining why he believes Chinese culture never gave rise to anything like the scientific revolution. Quote, there was no confidence, let's see, I think that's this quote is from Needham in the Red Book, Grand Titration. There was no confidence that the code of nature's laws could be unveiled and read, because there was no assurance that a divine being, even more rational than ourselves, had ever formulated such a code capable of being read. That's the quote from Needham. So he said that the Chinese couldn't do science because they didn't have the Christian worldview supporting them. There was no divine source from which to find the laws that undergird science. So now we get into Melvin Calvin, the chemical author, and he makes the same point. Quote, Calvin, as I try to discern the origin of that conviction that the universe could be understood rationally, I seem to find in it a basic notion discovered 2,000 or 3,000 years ago and enunciated first in the Western world by the ancient Hebrews, namely that the universe is governed by a single God and is not the product of the whims of many gods, each governing his own province according to his own laws. So Melvin Calvin says the universe is governed by a single God. He infers that it's the God of the Hebrews. This monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation of modern science, end quote, by Calvin. It is, of course, undeniable that in the ancient world and in the Eastern religions of Asia, the ideas of a single God and of an ordered universe that this God created were entirely foreign. The historian Carl Becker says the Western European Christian idea that God is goodness and reason led naturally to the idea that his creation must somehow be good and reasonable. Design in nature was thus derived a priori from the character which the creator was assumed to have. Design in nature arose from the designer. So when you hear apologists make the teleological argument, which speaks of the design in the universe and the world, I wonder if Becker is one of their source material. In 1964, the renowned physicist C.F. von Weizsäcker, in The Relevance of Science, put it this way, quote, matter, in the Platonic sense, which must be prevailed upon by reason, will not obey mathematical laws exactly. Matter, which God has created from nothing, may well strictly follow the rules which its creator has laid down for it. In a sense, I called modern science a legacy. I might even have said a child of Christianity. Modern science, says von Weizsäcker, is a child of Christianity, end quote. Stephen Meyer, in Return of the God Hypothesis, makes the most recent case for these ideas, quoting the social philosopher Steve Fuller, who says that science depends on, quote, on a, quote, natural order that is the product of a single intelligence from which our intelligence descends. Quote, Meyer also quotes the philosopher Holmes Rolleston III, quote, it was monotheism that launched the coming of physical science, for it premised an intelligible world, sacred but disenchanted, a world with a blueprint which was therefore open to the searches of the scientists. The great pioneers in physics, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, devoutly believed themselves called to find evidences of God in the physical world, end quote. So the people who were doing science were doing it because they were looking for evidences of God. Another important reason Western Christendom gave rise to science has to do with the value Christian doctrines place on the material world. Piercy and Thaxton explained that the Bible teaches that nature is real, while Hinduism teaches that the everyday world of material objects is Maya illusion, end quote. Therefore, it is, quote, doubtful whether a philosophy that so denigrates the material world would be capable of inspiring the careful attention to it that is necessary for science, end quote. So, yes, we need to pay close attention to the material world in order to be able to do science, and the Bible encourages us to do that. Christians in the early church defended a high view of the material world against the surrounding Greek culture of that time. Genesis made clear that God had created the world good, so the Greek idea, which we find in many other religions and philosophies, that the goal of this life is to escape the material or to escape our bodies, is not a biblical idea. However, some Christian sects have erred in this regard. The centrality of the human body to the Christian view cannot be clearer than when Jesus, after his death and resurrection, does not appear as a ghost, but as a human being in a body with discernible wounds in his hands and feet and side, and with an appetite, too, eating a piece of fish and honeycomb. If the goal of life were to transcend the corporeal, why would Jesus return in a body that required feeding? So the idea in many religions and in some bastardized expressions of Christianity that the body and physical matter are evil and must be escaped is not found in genuinely biblical faith. Piercy and Thaxton say that other religions often merged the spiritual with the material and often worshipped the creation itself. Boy, and that's interesting because that's flies in the face of Romans 1, where Paul criticizes, repudiates the idolatry of his day and the people who worship the creature rather than the creator who's blessed forever. Amen. The sun and moon and certain forces of nature were revered and feared and worshipped. Right. Romans 1. But Christians always understood the material world as a creation of God over which he had explicitly given them authority. And so, not fearing nature as often did, they were free to study it. Stephen Meyer says that both Needham and Marshall Hodgson came to the same conclusions as Whitehead. It was this specifically religious thinking about the doctrine of creation during the Catholic late Middle Ages and Protestant Reformation that changed everything, that set the stage for what we now call the scientific revolution. The Greeks gave the world Aristotle and Euclid and Pythagoras, not to mention the exquisite Antikythera mechanism, along with countless other inventions and technologies. Nonetheless, they were hindered by some deep-seated assumptions foreign to Christendom. What these assumptions are and what they entail is somewhat subtle. For example, the idea that a personal God had created all things and was different from the Greek idea that there was an inherent order, a logos underneath all things. A personal God might choose to do things in a way that was a bit quirkier or more creative and unpredictable than the perfect Platonic idea of a logos. For example, the idea that circles were perfect led the Greeks, Aristotle especially, to be sure that planets must move in circles. But those with a biblical view know that they must approach creation with humility and were obliged to actually observe things. Were obliged to actually observe how things were, rather than insist what things must be like from some preconceived notions. And of course, they discovered that planets orbited in ellipses rather than circles. In other words, the God of the Bible has personality and was therefore infinitely freer than the Greek idea of the pure mind. So discovering what he had created was something like interacting with another person, albeit one who was infinitely intelligent and creative. But he could and did seem to dream up things, creatures and phenomena, that appeared to be far beyond the rather predictable Greek god of the Logos, whom Aristotle called thought-thinking thought. What could be more abstract and ethereal, and in its way more dull than that? Would Aristotle's deity make a giraffe or a whale or a hummingbird? There was an abstract quality to Aristotelian and other Greek philosophy, one that drew them away from the specific and earthly and up toward the Platonic forms. There was a dualism at work, too, that eschewed this world of creation and yearned to transcend it and to achieve the independence from this world that led to pure thinking, and to Aristotle's impossibly Apollonian idea of a God that was pure mind, and which they called the Logos. Of course, the God of the Bible is this too, but he is simultaneously also a person who created the world in all of its stunning and often quirky imaginative specificity, and who then created human beings in his own image. And then, although he was always separate from his own creation, he nonetheless was involved in it and entered it creatively now and again. And so he was not so aloof from us that he did not take a personal interest in us. The Bible depicts a God who created the entire universe and invented atomic structure and subatomic structure, and who flung the trillions of galaxies into the courses, but who also wished to create a people for himself. He's obviously a dramatically far cry from the lifeless deity of Aristotle. The biblical God participates in human history, first through Abraham, then Moses and David and others, in order to launch his plan to reach all the other nations in the world. And of course, When the appointed time came, he entered the world himself as a human being to change the course of eternity too, in the person of Jesus. This is a wild idea, but the somewhat unpredictable quirkiness of these actions are the actions of the same God who, from his vantage point outside time and space, created time and space. This is hardly some Zeus or Ganesh. This is a perfect God outside of time and space, who nonetheless deigns to enter the messiness of time and space to create being in his extraordinary image, who are beings in his extraordinary image, who are intended not only for this material world, but by faith in him, for the world outside time and space in which he dwells. Right, through faith in Christ, we can enter heaven when we die, which is outside time and space, and which is where God dwells. There is at least one more reason the biblical view of things led the world to science, and this is the idea that humans are fallible and fallen. Fuller says that in the late Middle Ages and through the Protestant Reformation, the works of Augustine became popular, and the 4th and 5th century genius had brilliantly summed up the Bible's idea of man's twin nature. We were created in God's matchless image and therefore bore the imago Dei, but because we had also fallen from out of from our perfect state in paradise, we now also bore the Hecatem originus, or because we fell from our perfect state in paradise, we also bore original sin. As Meyer explains it, we had the extraordinary rational abilities to investigate and understand the material world around us, but we also were vulnerable to self-deception, flights of fancy, and prematurely jumping to conclusions. End quote by Meyer. So just as much as we were obliged to be excited about what we might find, we had to be realistic in how we processed what we found. We had to have a system which came to be called the scientific method that allowed us to submit our findings and our theories to an objective and rigorous investigation. We had to humble ourselves as we searched for knowledge by putting our findings and our ideas to the test. So science was not merely some individualistic Promethean project, it was something that had to be done in common with others. Even if we did not submit our findings to others, we could submit our findings to the rigorous scrutiny of the scientific method. We can see how these same biblical ideas led to self-government too. On the one hand, we were free and enabled by God to govern ourselves, but we also needed to make sure that there was a way to deal with our temptation to take freedom lightly and to put our self-interest beyond the mutually accepted norms of the common good. So we instituted social contracts and covenants and created a governmental order with checks and balances. This was the biblical idea of man's twin nature working itself out in history, so that the same Reformation, by returning to these biblical ideas, gave us the scientific revolution as well as self-government and the idea of human liberty. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that these ideas were widely accepted, but they first arose in the Middle Ages, especially in the work of the 13th century theologian Robert Grosseteste and his famous student Roger Bacon. The Australian historian of science Alistair C. Crombie has hailed Grosseteste as the real founder of the tradition of scientific thought at medieval Oxford, and in some ways of the modern English intellectual tradition. William of Occam's razor fame, was another 13th century theologian who contributed to moving beyond the ultimately simplistic Greek notions of so-called Aristotelian substantial forms and Plato's forms, and towards seeing the peculiarities and complexities of the material world. Occam's emphasis on the need for experimentation was an expression of the biblical idea that the natural world owes its orderly concourse to the free choice of an intelligent creator who could have made nature otherwise. It becomes unavoidable that Christian theology gave birth to what we presume to call science, so the misleading idea that faith and science or religion and rationality are not compatible must be rejected, and this tremendously harmful misconception must be publicized. The question is how so many of us could have been taken in by this silly idea for so long. But it appears that the facts of this matter are so threatening to those in the materialist atheist camp that they have done all they could to keep them hidden. But if the actual facts are that Christian faith is not only compatible with science, but actually led to science as we know it, might it not be possible that what is generally incompatible with science is atheism? Is atheism incompatible with science? One has often heard that the best defense is a good offense. And knowing what we know now about atheism, it becomes hard not to suspect that atheists have loudly and insistently allied themselves with science and rationality precisely because it turns out to be atheism that is incompatible with science and rationality. As Shakespeare said, quote, "Methinks the lady doth protest too much," end quote. In his recent book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, the Oxford mathematician Dr. John Lennox makes the case, quote, "Not surprisingly, I reject atheism because I believe Christianity to be true. But that's not my only reason. I also reject it because I'm a mathematician interested in science and rational thought. How could I espouse a worldview that arguably abolishes the very rationality I need to do mathematics?" By contrast, the biblical worldview that traces the origin of human rationality to the fact that we're created in the image of a rational God makes real sense as an explanation of why we can do science. Science and God mix very well. It's science and atheism that do not mix, end quote by Lennox. So if science arose directly from the worldview of the Bible, as has been shown, the willful inversion of these facts by the new atheists is a crime against truth in history worthy of a Joseph Stalin, who of course was an atheist himself, but who never felt the need to pretend to be devoted to reason. Man, that's such a good point. It's the materialist atheist who's guilty of what they're accusing the religion, the Christian of, the religious person of. It's the Christian it's the theist that's devoted to reason. It's the atheist that's not devoted to reason. But they think they're devoted to reason, and it lines up so beautifully with Scripture. Sadly, but beautifully with Scripture. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. I mean, Psalms say that the fool says that there is no God in his heart. The fool says in his heart there is no God. When you trade the God of the Bible for the God of self, basically, which is basically, if you're worshiping anything, if you're not worshiping the one true God, everybody worships something, whether they realize it or not. If you're not going to worship the one true God, maybe you're going to worship yourself or some other part of the creation, which is exactly what Romans 1 says we do. We exchange the truth of God for the lie, and we worship the creature, something created, rather than the creator. It goes against common sense. It goes against reason to exchange the truth of God for the lie. It goes against common sense. It goes against reason. And so that's why Metaxas can say that they pretend to be devoted to reason. It's not Stalin who pretended to be devoted to reason, but it's the contemporary new atheist who pretends to be devoted to reason. But they are unreasonable and irrational to do that. It's ironic that they do that, but they are unreasonable and irrational. It seems that the more one knows, the less one sees to excuse the new atheists and their sour philosophy. The record shows them to be, by turns, opportunistic, bombastic, and unrigorous on these most fundamental issues, so that taking them at all seriously seems at least a waste of time. They appear not to give a fig for the difficult facts, but have shouted themselves hoarse about their ardent dedication to science and rationality, as though nakedly claiming these things is all that's required. Richard Dawkins may have spent his career doing science, but in talking about what science actually is, he's shown himself to be hopelessly confused. We might expect scientists to be able to do science, but we should not expect them to understand the idea of science any more than we can expect a fish to understand how he swims. But as Western cultures become increasingly secular, many of us have looked to scientists to be something like a new priesthood, dispensing wisdom they do not have. So we cannot fault Dawkins for using the bully pulpit he's been given to express his opinions, but we can and must fault him for the wild error in those opinions. He's hardly the first to hurtle heedlessly past the boundaries of his political field of knowledge. as the enticement to do so is heady, anyone who has read Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism will learn two things Freud did not intend. The first being that Freud's field of expertise was not religion, and the second being that this did not prevent the fact that Freud's expertise was not religion did not prevent him from thinking his expertise was religion. We've mentioned Carl Sagan, who was the popular voice of science in the 1970s and who was the host of the Cosmos TV series of that time. More recently, another astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, has followed in Sagan's footsteps by putting forward utterly false ideas, and like Sagan, has cheerfully misled millions. For example, Tyson claims it was a falling away from belief in God that enabled Isaac Newton to succeed as a scientist. This is so false that it's staggering, and it is no less than shocking to think that Tyson could have said it, or that the producers of the program could have let it pass. There are mountains of evidence against this and other things Tyson claimed. So how can we doubt that his own bias against faith twisted his ability to lay out the simplest facts of the story? But then we must also wonder how these self-proclaimed priests of rationality could think that putting forth untruths would serve the purposes of rationality in science. As recently as 2019, no less scientific a publication than Scientific American published an interview with Marcelo Gleiser, a Dartmouth College theoretical physicist, in which he underscored the increasingly less avoidable reality we've been discussing. Here's the quote from Gleiser. Quote, "I think atheism is inconsistent with the scientific method. What I mean by that is, what is atheism? It is a statement, a categorical statement that expresses belief and non-belief. I don't believe, even though I have no evidence for or against. Simply, I don't believe. Period. It's a declaration. But in science, we don't really do declarations. We say, okay, you can have a hypothesis. You have to have some evidence against or for that. And so an agnostic would say, look, I have no evidence for God or any kind of God. What God, first of all? The Maori gods or the Jewish or the Christian or Muslim God? Which God is that? End quote. But on the other, well, not really end quote, but on the other hand, an agnostic would acknowledge no right to make a final statement about something he or she doesn't know about. The agnostic can't say there is or there is not a God. They say they don't know. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence and all that. This positions me very much against all of the new atheist guys. Even though I want my message to be respectful of people's beliefs and reasoning, which might be community-based or dignity-based and so on, it's not just me. It's also my colleague, the astrophysicist Adam Frank, and a bunch of others talking more and more about the relation between science and spirituality. It's Marcelo Gleiser. This case has been made many times and cannot be logically refuted. Nevertheless, often playing to audiences ignorant of such things, the new atheists in their season strutted like popinjays across the cultural stage, drinking in the adulation of those they deceived, and never showing any hints of shame for having done so. End quote. What to make of it? One could quote Fielding Mellish and declare it to be a travesty of a mockery of a sham, of a mockery of a travesty, and two mockeries of a sham. And isn't it? From what we know, books and bitter speeches of these new atheists appear to be the last gasps of a dead religion. Gleiser and innumerable other scientists attest, not only are faith and science compatible, but those who pervert science into scientism and into a preposterous ideology of strict materialism are themselves being aggressively unscientific and irrational. It is unavoidable. Atheism is, by definition, anti-science. These are the strange but true facts, and we must revise our understanding of things to account for them. That is the end of chapter 26 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time we will look at chapter 27. We will see some further problems with atheism. Thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.